One photograph. 6 men raising a flag on a mountaintop. February 23rd, 1945. It became the most famous image of World War II, reproduced millions of times, turned into a 78-foot bronze memorial in Arlington. Used to sell $26 billion in war bonds, more money than any other fundraising campaign in American history. 3 of those 6 men died within weeks, never knowing they'd become immortal. But here's what almost nobody knows. What wouldn't be discovered for 71 years. One of the men everyone celebrated wasn't even in the photograph. And that's not even the deepest secret this image conceals. Because that famous photograph, the one that defined American sacrifice, the one that justified everything that happened on this island, wasn't the first flag raised that day. It was the second. Specifically requested to be bigger, more visible. A replacement flag sent up because military commanders thought the first one wasn't impressive enough for the cameras and the troops still fighting below. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the most famous moment of the battle was essentially staged for better optics, what else about this story isn't quite what we've been told? This is the story of Iwo Jima. 8 square miles of volcanic rock. 60,000 Americans against 21,000 Japanese defenders. 36 days of combat so brutal it would produce more medals of honor than any battle in American history. A place where, in the words of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, uncommon valor was a common virtue. But it's also the story of a battle that military planners promised would take 5 days, and instead took 5 weeks. A battle fought for an island that some historians now argue wasn't worth the 7,000 American lives it cost. A battle commanded on the Japanese side by a general who had lived in America, studied at Harvard, and knew exactly how to make Americans bleed for every yard of volcanic ash. And decades later, when the costs were counted and the justifications examined, people would ask a question that veterans hated but couldn't quite answer. Was any of it necessary? To understand that question, and why it matters, we need to begin not with that famous photograph, but with the island itself, with distance, with strategy, and with a Japanese general who was building something beneath the ground that American intelligence never saw coming. Picture, if you will, a morning in February. The date is the 19th, the year 1945. The Pacific Ocean spreads vast and dark under a sky not yet fully awake. In these waters, hundreds of ships gather, their hulls cutting through gentle swells. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. A floating city of steel and purpose, all converging on a single point. And that point, that destination visible in the grey dawn light, is an island that rises from the sea like a scar. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, ash, and sulfur. The Japanese call it Iwo To, though the Americans know it by another name. Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island. Even from a distance you can smell it, that acrid mineral scent that stings the nostrils and settles in the back of the throat. At its southern tip stands Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano, 550 feet of dark stone that seems to watch the approaching fleet with something like malevolence. This mountain will become the most photographed piece of terrain in military history. But on this morning, it is simply a landmark, a geological feature that happens to command every approach to the beaches below. Aboard the transport ships, 60,000 United States Marines prepare themselves. They check their weapons, adjust their packs, write final letters home. Some pray, others sit in silence. Many have fought before, at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu. They know what awaits them. The newer ones, the replacements, try to imagine it. But imagination fails in the face of what Iwo Jima will demand. This battle, this 36-day struggle for a speck of volcanic ash in the middle of the Pacific, will become one of the defining moments of the Second World War. It will produce more medals of honor than any other single engagement in American history. It will cost nearly 7,000 American lives and wound 20,000 more. It will all but annihilate the 21,000 Japanese defenders, leaving only 216 prisoners. And decades later, historians will still argue whether it was necessary, whether the strategic value justified the rivers of blood that would soak into that black volcanic sand. But on this February morning, those debates belong to the future. What matters now is the island, the mountain, and the men preparing to fight for both. This is not a story of glory, though acts of extraordinary courage will mark every hour. This is not a tale of easy victory, though victory will eventually come. This is the story of Iwo Jima, where uncommon valor became, in the words of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, a common virtue. Where the bloodiest beach landing in Marine Corps history began with the roar of naval guns and ended 5 weeks later with silence broken only by the wind. Let us begin not with the landing, but with understanding why this island mattered so much that two great powers would sacrifice so many lives to possess it. Part 1. The strategic chessboard. To understand Iwo Jima, you must first understand distance. Picture a map of the Pacific, that vast blue expanse dotted with islands like stepping stones across an ocean. By early 1945, American forces had fought their way across this ocean, island by island, battle by bloody battle. They had taken the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas. In the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the United States now possessed bases from which the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. This was the key to victory, or so the strategic planners believed. These massive four-engine bombers, technological marvels of their time, could carry enormous bomb loads over vast distances. From the Marianas to Tokyo measured approximately 1,500 miles each way. A B-29 crew faced a round trip of 3,000 miles, most of it over open ocean, all of it within range of Japanese interceptors once they neared the home islands. Engine failures were common. Battle damage was expected. And between the Marianas and Japan, stretching across those 1,500 miles of water, there was almost nowhere to land if something went wrong. Almost nowhere, but not quite nowhere. Because halfway between the American base and the Japanese capital, there sat a small volcanic island. 8 square miles of worthless terrain, no fresh water, barely any vegetation, but possessing 3 airfields. 3 landing strips that could serve as an emergency haven for crippled bombers, a refueling stop for fighter escorts, a base for air-sea rescue operations. The Japanese called it Iwo To. The Americans would make it famous as Iwo Jima. The strategic calculus seemed straightforward. Every B-29 that crashed into the Pacific represented not just the loss of an aircraft worth over $600,000, but the loss of 11 highly trained crewmen. In the early months of the bombing campaign, losses were substantial. Mechanical failures plagued the complex B-29 engines. Japanese fighters rose to meet the bombers over the home islands, and the weather in the Pacific could turn violent without warning, forcing damaged aircraft to ditch at sea. But there was more to the strategic picture than just emergency landings. Iwo Jima itself posed a direct threat to the American bombing campaign. The Japanese had established radar facilities on the island, providing early warning of every B-29 strike headed north. This gave the home islands precious minutes to scramble fighters and prepare anti-aircraft defenses. Moreover, Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima regularly harassed the American bases in the Marianas, forcing the B-29s to take longer, more dangerous routes to avoid interception. Between November 1944 and January 1945, these Iwo Jima-based fighters destroyed 11 B-29s and damaged 47 more. The solution appeared obvious. Take Iwo Jima. Eliminate the Japanese radar. Remove the fighter threat. Establish emergency landing fields. Base American fighter escorts to protect the bombers all the way to Japan and back. It was logical, practical, necessary. Or so it seemed to the planners at Pacific Command Headquarters. The decision was made in late September and early October of 1944 at a strategic conference in San Francisco. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, presented the case for Operation Detachment, the code name for the invasion of Iwo Jima. The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved. The date was set for February the 19th, 1945. The Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, would provide naval support. 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, would conduct the assault. And commanding these Marines would be Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, known throughout the Corps by his nickname Howlin' Mad Smith. The Marines expected a tough fight. They always did. But intelligence estimates suggested that Iwo Jima would fall quickly, perhaps in as little as 5 days. After all, the island was small. The garrison, thought to number around 13,000 Japanese troops, would be subjected to months of preliminary bombardment from the air and sea. Surely such relentless pounding would break their defenses, destroy their artillery, collapse their fighting spirit. These estimates reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Japanese had been doing on Iwo Jima for the past 8 months, and they failed to account for the man who had been sent to defend the island, a man who would prove to be one of the most formidable opponents the Marines would face in the entire Pacific War. Part 2. The general and his fortress, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944. Born into a samurai family in Nagano Prefecture in 1891, he had graduated second in his class from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. But here's what made him different from almost every other Japanese general. He had lived in America. From 1928 to 1931, Kuribayashi served as a military attaché in Washington, studying at the U.S. Army War College, visiting automobile factories in Detroit, traveling across the country. While his fellow officers in Tokyo spoke confidently about Japanese spiritual superiority defeating American materialism, Kuribayashi had seen with his own eyes the factories, the resources, the industrial capacity that Japan could never match. He wrote letters to his wife that, if discovered by the wrong people, might have been considered treasonous. In one letter, preserved in family archives, he stated bluntly, "The United States is the last country in the world Japan should fight. Its industrial potential is huge and fabulous, and the people are energetic and versatile. One must never underestimate the American fighting ability." This understanding, evident from his surviving letters and documented by historians who studied his career, must have made his assignment to Iwo Jima particularly bitter. When Prime Minister Hideki Tojo summoned him in May 1944, Kuribayashi would have recognized immediately what was being asked of him. His letters suggest a man who understood the strategic reality. Not to win, victory was impossible, but to make the Americans bleed so badly that they might reconsider the cost of invading Japan itself. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo summoned Kuribayashi to his office in May 1944 and told him he had been chosen to defend Iwo Jima. The general understood what this meant. He was being sent to die. The question was not whether he would win. Victory was impossible. The question was how much time he could buy, how many American lives he could take, how deeply he could make the Americans bleed before the inevitable end. Traditional Japanese defensive doctrine called for meeting invasions at the water's edge. The idea was to destroy the enemy on the beaches, throw them back into the sea before they could establish a beachhead. It was a doctrine that had failed repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. American naval gunfire and air power simply overwhelmed any beach defenses. Troops caught in the open were slaughtered. Fortifications above ground were pulverized, and once the Americans established themselves ashore, they could not be dislodged. Kuribayashi rejected this approach entirely. He had studied the recent battle on Peleliu, where Colonel Nakagawa Kunio had pioneered a new defensive strategy. Fight from underground, let the enemy land unopposed, then bleed them in a war of attrition using caves, tunnels, and concealed positions. The tactic had proven devastatingly effective. The Americans had expected to take Peleliu in 4 days. Instead, the battle lasted 2 months and cost thousands of American casualties. Kuribayashi would take Nakagawa's approach and perfect it. He would turn Iwo Jima into a fortress unlike anything the Americans had encountered, and he had 8 months to do it. The island's volcanic geology worked in his favor. The rock was soft enough to tunnel through with hand tools, yet strong enough to withstand all but direct hits from the heaviest naval shells. Below ground, naturally occurring caves connected and could be expanded into vast chambers. The heat was intense. Sulfur fumes and volcanic gases made the work hellish. But Kuribayashi drove his men relentlessly. He assembled an army of engineers. Using his contacts and administrative skills, he diverted 300 skilled engineers from other commands. He recruited another 700 from various units. The Imperial Navy provided 1,200 more. In total, a quarter of his garrison would be devoted to tunneling and construction. "Every soldier is an engineer," became Kuribayashi's motto, and every one of those soldiers would spend months beneath the earth, carving out the fortress that would make Iwo Jima a nightmare. The numbers tell only part of the story. By the time the Marines landed in February, Kuribayashi's men had excavated 11 miles of tunnels connecting defensive positions across the island. Some tunnels ran 75 feet below ground, far beyond the reach of naval artillery. Large chambers could hold 300 to 400 men. Command posts were established deep underground, complete with electricity, telephone lines, and ventilation systems to combat the sulfur fumes. The main communications center south of Kita village featured a chamber 50 meters long and 20 meters wide. General Kuribayashi's own command post, located 500 meters northeast of Kita village, was similarly massive and similarly deep. Multiple entrances and exits ensured that troops trapped in one section could escape through another. Interconnecting passages allowed rapid movement of forces without exposing them to American fire. Stairways linked different levels, creating a 3-dimensional maze that would confound every attempt to clear it. Above ground, Kuribayashi authorized only minimal defenses. His superiors in Tokyo insisted on some beach fortifications. Tradition demanded it. So he built a handful of pillboxes near the landing beaches as a token gesture. But his heart was in the hidden defenses, the positions that American intelligence would never spot, that preliminary bombardment would never destroy. On Mount Suribachi alone, the Japanese excavated several thousand yards of tunnels. Artillery positions were dug into the mountain slopes, their guns covered and concealed. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across the beaches. Observers could see every approach, and all of it was connected. All of it could be reinforced or evacuated through the tunnel network. The northern plateau, where the main defensive zone would be established, bristled with even more elaborate fortifications. Hill 382, known to the Japanese as Nidan Iwa, became a fortress within the fortress. Near its summit, a radio and weather station was constructed. Just southeast of the station, an enormous blockhouse served as the headquarters of Colonel Chosaku Kaido, who commanded all artillery on Iwo Jima. Other hills in the northern sector were similarly tunneled and fortified. Weapons were positioned with obsessive care. Artillery pieces were moved constantly between caves and firing positions, making them almost impossible to target. 320mm spigot mortars, massive weapons that could lob enormous shells in high arcs, were placed to rain death on the beaches. A variety of explosive rockets supplemented the conventional artillery. Hundreds of machine guns covered every approach. Anti-tank guns waited in ambush positions. And everything, every weapon, every position, every field of fire, was designed according to Kuribayashi's master plan: maximum coverage and cross-coverage of terrain with maximum force. The defensive concept was elegant in its brutality. No banzai charges, no wasteful screaming attacks in which men threw away their lives for honor and achieved nothing. Instead, every Japanese soldier would fight from cover, falling back through the tunnel network when necessary, emerging to fight again when opportunity presented itself. The goal was not to win. That was impossible. The goal was to kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier lost, to make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they would hesitate before launching the next operation, before invading Okinawa, before contemplating an assault on the Japanese home islands themselves. Kuribayashi knew his men would need more than just fortifications. They would need the right mindset, the willingness to endure hardship and death without the false comfort of believing they could win. He shared their hardships, refusing special privileges despite his rank. He ate the same meager rations. He forbade the traditional suicide charges. He visited wounded men in hospitals, something virtually unheard of for a general officer. And he told them the truth. They were going to die on this island, but their deaths would matter. They would demonstrate to the Americans that the cost of invading Japan would be unbearable. The supply situation was adequate, but not generous. Food would last 4 months. Ammunition equaled about 60% of what would normally be considered sufficient for an extended engagement. Water was scarce. The island had no natural sources, and supplies had to be shipped in or collected from rain. But Kuribayashi made do with what he had, husbanding his resources, positioning his supplies in underground depots throughout the island, where American bombardment could not destroy them. By early January 1945, Kuribayashi's garrison had grown to approximately 21,000 men. This included the 109th Infantry Division, various independent mixed brigades, tank units, artillery regiments, and Imperial Navy personnel. These were not all elite troops. Many were conscripts, older men or younger men without extensive training. But they were soldiers of the Japanese Empire, and they would fight with the same desperate determination that had characterized every Pacific battle. In late January, as American aircraft began their intensified bombardment of the island, Kuribayashi sent a message to Imperial General Headquarters. The message was realistic, almost fatalistic. "We shall fight until the last man. I fear we will be destroyed within 2 weeks. However, I am confident we can hold out for 1 month." It was a prophecy that would prove both wrong and right. The battle would last longer than he predicted, 36 days instead of 2 weeks. But it would be every bit as bloody as he feared. The Americans, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of what Kuribayashi had created. Intelligence reports suggested that the island was defended by about 13,000 troops. Reconnaissance photographs showed some fortifications, but the vast underground network remained invisible. Planners assumed that months of bombardment would destroy most defensive positions. They estimated that casualties would be moderate, perhaps comparable to Tarawa, but spread over a larger force. 5 days to secure the island, they said. A week at most. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Part 3. The Fifth Fleet assembles. As February approached, the largest amphibious assault force yet assembled in the Pacific, gathered in the waters near the Marianas. The Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, represented American naval power at its zenith. Over 450 ships converged for Operation Detachment. Aircraft carriers, their decks crowded with planes. Battleships, their massive guns capable of hurling shells weighing more than a ton. Cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, landing craft, an armada that stretched to the horizon. Among these ships moved the men who would conduct the assault. 3 Marine divisions, each with its own character and history. The 3rd Marine Division, commanded by Major General Graves Erskine, would serve as the floating reserve, waiting offshore to be committed if needed. The 4th Marine Division, under Major General Clifton Cates, would land on the right flank. The 5th Marine Division, led by Major General Keller Rocky, would hit the left. Together, these divisions comprised the 5th Amphibious Corps, under the overall command of Major General Harry Schmidt. And overseeing the entire expeditionary force was Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, Howlin' Mad Smith, a Marine legend whose aggressive tactics and volcanic temper had made him famous throughout the Pacific. Smith had commanded Marines at Tarawa, at Saipan, at Tinian. He had seen the butcher's bill that came with amphibious assaults on defended islands. But even Smith, with all his experience, could not fully grasp what awaited his Marines on Iwo Jima. The preliminary bombardment began on December 8, 1944. B-24 Liberator bombers from the 7th Air Force in the Marianas pounded Iwo Jima day after day. By the time the invasion fleet arrived, the island had endured 74 days of continuous air attack, the longest and most intensive preparatory bombardment in the Pacific War. Thousands of tons of bombs rained down. Napalm scorched the landscape. The Americans assumed that nothing could survive such punishment, but bombs are notoriously ineffective against underground positions. Most of the damage was cosmetic. Airfields were cratered and quickly repaired. A few surface installations were destroyed. But the vast tunnel network remained intact. The hidden gun positions remained concealed. And General Kuribayashi's garrison, living like moles beneath the earth, survived with minimal casualties. The naval bombardment began on February 16th, 3 days before the scheduled landing. Major General Schmidt had requested 10 days of naval gunfire to soften up the defenses. He was granted 3. The decision came from higher up the chain of command. Admiral Nimitz had a tight schedule. Okinawa was next on the list, and the 5th Fleet needed to move quickly from one objective to the next. For 3 days, American battleships and cruisers hammered Iwo Jima. The old battle wagons, Nevada, Texas, New York, Tennessee, Idaho, Arkansas. Ships that had seen service since World War I now brought their heavy guns to bear. 16-inch shells screamed across the water and exploded on the island. Smaller caliber guns added to the fury. Aircraft from the carriers dove and strafed. The noise was continuous, overwhelming, apocalyptic. On the island, General Kuribayashi ordered his men to stay underground. He had strictly forbidden any response to the bombardment. Every shot fired would reveal a position. Every revealed position would be targeted. So the Japanese endured in silence, huddled in their caves while the world above them exploded. Some positions were destroyed, the token beach defenses mostly, the pillboxes that Kuribayashi had built only to satisfy his superiors. But the real defenses, the positions that mattered, survived. On February 17th, underwater demolition teams, the Navy's elite frogmen, swam in to reconnoiter the beaches. Their mission was to check for obstacles, mines, anything that might impede the landing craft. It was dangerous work. The frogmen came under fire from hidden positions. Some were wounded, some were killed, but they gathered valuable intelligence. The approaches were relatively clear. No major obstacles, no extensive mining. The beaches appeared suitable for a landing. This should have been a warning. Why would the Japanese leave the beaches so lightly defended? Why no obstacles, no mines, no determined resistance at the water's edge? But the information was interpreted optimistically. Perhaps the bombardment had been more effective than expected. Perhaps the defenses were weaker than feared. Perhaps this would be easier than anticipated. In the pre-dawn darkness of February 19th, the Marines made their final preparations. Some wrote last letters home, some sharpened combat knives, some simply sat in silence, alone with their thoughts. The veterans among them knew what was coming: the terror, the chaos, the brutal arithmetic of combat where some would live and others would die for no reason that anyone could explain. The newer men tried to imagine it and failed. At 0640, the naval bombardment reached a crescendo. Every gun in the fleet seemed to fire at once. The dawn sky lit up with muzzle flashes, the air filled with the shriek of shells. Iwo Jima disappeared behind a curtain of smoke and flame. Standing on the decks of the transport ships, Marines must have allowed themselves a moment of hope. Surely nothing could survive such fury. Surely the defenses were shattered. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption was. At 0900, the first wave of Marines climbed into their landing craft and began the run to the beach. Part 4. D-Day. February 19th, 1945. The landing craft carrying the assault waves approached the southeastern beaches of Iwo Jima in neat lines, their formations precise despite the swells that rocked the small vessels. From the transports several miles offshore, the island looked surreal, almost dreamlike, covered in the smoke of the morning barrage. Mount Suribachi loomed dark against the sky, its crater rim clearly visible even through the haze. The beaches, when they could be seen through the smoke, appeared as dark, grey-black volcanic sand, rising in steep terraces from the water's edge. The assault plan was complex, the product of months of planning. The 4th Marine Division would land on the right flank, on beaches designated Yellow 1, Yellow 2, Blue 1, and Blue 2. The 5th Marine Division would hit the left flank, landing on beaches designated Red 1 and Red 2, and Green Beach. The divisions would advance inland simultaneously. The 5th would wheel left and assault Mount Suribachi. The 4th would drive straight across the island, cutting Iwo Jima in two at its narrowest point. Then both divisions would turn north toward the main Japanese defenses. The 3rd Marine Division would remain offshore as the floating reserve, ready to be committed when and where needed. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, the first wave of landing craft grounded on the beaches. Ramps dropped. Marines poured out, weapons ready, expecting the worst. Some flinched as they left the shelter of the landing craft, anticipating the storm of fire that would meet them. Others moved with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this before, at other beaches on other islands. The new men, the replacements who hadn't yet experienced combat, tried to do what their training had taught them, tried to move quickly, tried not to think. For those first few minutes, the landing seemed almost easy. Sporadic fire greeted the Marines, a few artillery shells, some mortar rounds, scattered small arms fire, but nothing like the hurricane of steel that had met them at Tarawa or Saipan. The naval bombardment, the Marines thought, must have worked better than expected. The Japanese must be stunned, disorganized, unable to coordinate an effective defense. Some Marines, veterans who had survived previous landings, recognized this quiet as ominous. But for the moment, they advanced, grateful for whatever fortune had granted them this respite. The 2nd Battalion, 27th Marines hit Blue Beach 1 on the 4th Division's right flank. Their objective was to drive straight across the island to the opposite shore, a distance of less than 1,000 yards, across Iwo Jima's narrow waist. Simple geography suggested this should be achievable quickly. But within minutes of landing, the battalion encountered the island's first terrible secret: the volcanic sand. It wasn't like any sand the Marines had encountered before. At first glance, it looked like ordinary beach material. Dark grey, fine-grained, packed firm near the waterline. But appearances were murderously deceptive. As soon as Marines stepped beyond the hard-packed wet sand near the surf, they sank. Ankle-deep with the first step. Knee-deep within a few more strides. The sand had the consistency of coarse flour, offering no purchase, no resistance. Each step became an exercise in exhaustion. You would lift your foot, and the sand would pour back into the depression, erasing any progress. You would try to run, and the sand would swallow your legs, turning sprints into slow-motion nightmares. The terraces, steep embankments rising from the beach in a series of steps, each 8 to 15 feet high, were worse. Under normal circumstances, Marines would have scrambled up such slopes in seconds. But these terraces were composed entirely of that treacherous volcanic ash. Climbing them became an exercise in futility and frustration. You would take 2 steps up and slide 1 step back. You would claw at the slope, grabbing handfuls of sand that simply poured through your fingers. You would finally gain the top of one terrace, exhausted, only to face another terrace ahead, and another beyond that. Vehicles were even more helpless than men. The first jeeps and trucks that rolled off the landing craft immediately bogged down. Their wheels, designed to grip soil or hard sand, simply spun uselessly in the volcanic ash. The vehicles sank until their axles rested on the sand, wheels spinning 6 inches above any purchase. Half-tracks did marginally better, but not much. Even tracked vehicles, light tanks and Amtraks, struggled. Their tracks would dig deep furrows, throwing up rooster tails of black sand, but making minimal forward progress. The beach quickly became a nightmarish traffic jam. More landing craft kept arriving, disgorging more men, more vehicles, more supplies. All of it funneled onto beaches where movement forward was agonizingly slow and movement backward was blocked by the continuing waves of incoming craft. Men and machines clustered in ever denser concentrations, unable to advance quickly, unable to retreat, just accumulating on those deadly beaches. Which was exactly what General Kuribayashi had calculated. The Japanese commander had watched the landing from his command post in the northern highlands. Reports came in from observers on Mount Suribachi and from positions overlooking the beaches. Americans were landing in strength. They were struggling with the terrain, just as Kuribayashi had known they would. They were bunching up on the beaches, presenting targets of ever-increasing density. Kuribayashi waited. Patience was crucial. Let more Americans land. Let them commit more troops, more equipment. Let them become thoroughly entangled in that volcanic quicksand. And then, only then, spring the trap. At approximately 9:30, 30 minutes after the first wave landed, Kuribayashi gave the order that his gunners had been awaiting. Every Japanese weapon within range of the beaches opened fire at once. Artillery hidden in Mount Suribachi suddenly revealed itself, muzzle flashes appearing from cave mouths that had seemed empty moments before. Guns began firing in methodical sequence, traversing left to right across the beaches, each shell exploding among the packed Marines below. More artillery, positioned in the northern highlands, joined in. These guns had the entire length of the beaches registered as target areas. They didn't need to aim at specific targets. They simply fired into the densest concentrations, knowing that every shell would find victims. Mortars added their distinctive sound to the symphony of death. These high-angle weapons were perfect for attacking troops behind cover. A mortar round would arc high into the sky, nearly vertical at the apex of its trajectory, then plunge straight down into the volcanic sand. The soft surface muffled the explosion's sound, but the fragments were no less deadly. Marines crouching behind the terraces, thinking themselves sheltered from direct fire, would die from mortar fragments that rained down from above. Rockets screamed from concealed launchers. The Japanese had positioned various types of rocket weapons around the island, including massive 320mm spigot mortars that hurled enormous projectiles in high arcs. These weapons were inaccurate, but terrifying. The sound of an incoming rocket was distinctive, a shrieking that grew louder as the projectile approached, culminating in an explosion that could obliterate everything within a 30-yard radius. And everywhere, machine guns. The Japanese had positioned hundreds of machine gun nests, each carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire. They were positioned not to fire directly at the landing beaches. That would have made them visible and vulnerable to the American bombardment, but to fire along the beaches from flanking positions. A machine gun firing from Mount Suribachi could sweep the length of the southern beaches with enfilade fire. A machine gun positioned in the low hills just inland from the beaches could rake Marines attempting to advance. The gunners worked methodically, firing in short, disciplined bursts to conserve ammunition and make their positions harder to locate. The Marines went down in dozens, then scores, then hundreds. Men who had been struggling through the sand suddenly collapsed, hit by bullets or fragments they never saw coming. Others, untouched themselves, watched comrades die and could do nothing but keep moving, keep trying to get off those beaches. Navy corpsmen, medics assigned to the Marine units, moved among the wounded, triaging, administering morphine, applying bandages. Many corpsmen would become casualties themselves. Some were hit while treating wounded Marines. Others died trying to reach men who were crying out for help. The volcanic sand, which had made advancing so difficult, now made evacuation even harder. Carrying a stretcher across soft sand was exhausting under the best conditions. Doing it under fire, with shells exploding and bullets cracking overhead, while struggling to keep from sinking with each step, required superhuman effort. It often took 4 or 6 men to carry one wounded Marine to the evacuation points near the beach. Aid stations, hastily set up behind whatever cover could be found, were quickly overwhelmed. Corpsmen and surgeons worked frantically, performing emergency surgery in the open, trying to stabilize the wounded for evacuation to the hospital ships offshore. The landing craft that had brought Marines ashore now began the grim task of evacuating wounded. But approaching the beaches was dangerous. Japanese artillery targeted the craft. Some took direct hits and exploded in geysers of water, flame, and fragments. Others, damaged but still afloat, would limp back toward the ships with wounded crew and casualties aboard. The coxswains, Navy personnel who piloted the landing craft, showed extraordinary courage, running the gauntlet again and again, knowing that each approach to the beach might be their last. Despite the carnage, despite the chaos, the landing continued. Wave after wave of Marines came ashore. The assault plan called for 30,000 men to land on D-Day, and the plan would be executed regardless of the cost. Company after company, battalion after battalion, they waded through the surf and began the terrible crawl inland. On the left flank, the 28th Marines of the 5th Division had the mission of isolating and then capturing Mount Suribachi. They landed on the green beach, the closest beach to the mountain. From the moment they stepped ashore, they came under fire from the mountain itself. Machine guns firing from caves carved into Suribachi's base. Artillery positioned on the mountain slopes. Mortars dropping from positions that seemed to have perfect visibility of every Marine movement. The 28th Marines took casualties immediately, but they kept moving, pressing toward the base of the mountain, knowing that until Suribachi fell, every Marine on the southern beaches would remain under observation and fire. In the center, the 23rd Marines of the 4th Division aimed for the first airfield, Motoyama Airfield No. 1. This flat expanse of ground, cratered by months of bombardment but still identifiable as an airfield, lay about 600 yards inland from the landing beaches. Between the beaches and the airfield lay open ground. No cover, no concealment, just volcanic sand and rock under the observation of Japanese positions to the north. The 23rd Marines advanced through this killing ground, taking losses every yard of the way, but pressing forward because stopping would mean dying where you stood, pinned down with no shelter. On the right flank, the 25th Marines drove for the eastern shore, aiming to cut the island in two. They encountered the same nightmarish terrain, the same murderous fire, the same terrible arithmetic where every yard gained cost lives. But they pushed forward, motivated by training, by unit pride, by the knowledge that their comrades were depending on them, by the simple momentum of events that left no time to stop and think about the odds. By mid-morning, despite the horrendous casualties, despite the nightmare of the terrain, the Marines had established a tenuous foothold. They controlled sections of the beach, had advanced several hundred yards inland in some sectors, had begun the bloody work of reducing the nearest Japanese positions. But calling it a foothold was generous. They clung to that volcanic rock by their fingernails, suffering under constant fire, advancing by yards when they advanced at all. The assault continued through the afternoon. More Marines came ashore as the later waves landed. Heavy equipment, bulldozers, cranes, ammunition trucks followed, though much of it never made it off the beaches, bogged down in the sand or destroyed by Japanese fire. Artillery batteries landed and tried to set up firing positions, struggling to emplace their guns in sand that offered no stable foundation. Tank battalions came ashore, their armor providing some protection but limited mobility in the soft terrain. By mid-afternoon, the 25th Marines had achieved their objective. They reached the eastern shore of Iwo Jima, cutting the island in two. It was a significant accomplishment, one that planners had hoped for but hadn't been certain could be achieved on D-Day. Mount Suribachi was now isolated from the main Japanese forces to the north. But the cost of this success was written in the aid stations that overflowed with casualties, in the lists of dead that grew longer with each hour. As evening approached, the assault units dug in as best they could, preparing for the night. Japanese tactics throughout the Pacific War had included heavy use of night infiltration and surprise attacks. Every Marine who had fought on previous islands knew what to expect: probing attacks by small groups, attempts to infiltrate the American lines, sudden close-quarters combat in the darkness. Sentries were posted, fields of fire were established, trip flares were set. Marines checked their weapons, made sure they had sufficient ammunition close at hand, and tried to rest while staying alert for the first sign of trouble. That first night was tense, but not as catastrophic as some had feared. General Kuribayashi had strictly forbidden his troops from launching large-scale banzai charges. Such attacks, he had observed, wasted Japanese lives without inflicting proportional American casualties. Better to let the Americans attack fortified positions. Better to make them come to you, make them pay for every yard. So the night attacks, when they came, were small-scale, infiltrators cutting telephone wires, sappers attempting to destroy American equipment, small groups trying to find gaps in the perimeter. Some succeeded, most were killed in the attempt. Offshore, the Navy's guns continued their work through the darkness, firing illumination rounds that lit up the battlefield in harsh, flickering light, and firing on suspected Japanese positions whenever they were identified. Aircraft from the carriers flew night missions, dropping bombs on areas behind Japanese lines, trying to disrupt any preparations for counterattacks. In the aid stations and on the hospital ships, surgeons worked through the night, trying to save the wounded. Some would survive. Some, despite the best efforts of medical personnel, would die of their wounds. The hospital ships began to fill with casualties, men with shattered limbs, penetrating wounds, burns, traumatic amputations. The medical staff, trained for mass casualties but still overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, did what they could. By nightfall on February the 19th, the first day of the battle, the casualty figures were already appalling. More than 2,400 Marines had been killed, wounded, or were missing. Some sources would later cite slightly different numbers, some saying 2,400, others saying as many as 2,500. The exact figure mattered less than what it represented. This was the highest single-day casualty rate of any amphibious landing in Marine Corps history. And everyone, from the newest replacement to the most experienced commander, knew with grim certainty that this was just the beginning. The objective of securing the island in 5 days now seemed like a fantasy. Mount Suribachi still loomed above the beaches, its observation posts still directing fire. The northern highlands remained untouched, still held by the bulk of Kuribayashi's garrison. 3 airfields lay ahead, each one doubtless as heavily defended as the territory already taken. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. If 1 day had cost 2,400 casualties, what would 5 days cost? 10 days? 20? No one wanted to calculate that arithmetic. They just wanted to survive the night and face whatever the morning would bring. Part 5. The first 5 days. Blood on black sand. The second day of battle, February 20th, began with a discovery that would become famous. Marines advancing across the neck of the island reached the western shore, cutting Iwo Jima in 2. Mount Suribachi was now isolated from the main Japanese defenses to the north. This was a significant tactical achievement, but it came at a cost. The units that made this crossing came under fire from both flanks. Japanese positions on Suribachi to the south and Japanese positions in the highlands to the north could both target the Marines in the middle. The 28th Marines, tasked with taking Mount Suribachi, began their assault on the extinct volcano. From below, it appeared impossibly steep, its slopes dotted with caves and crevasses, its summit lost in smoke from the ongoing naval bombardment. Intelligence suggested that the mountain was heavily fortified, and intelligence was correct. Kuribayashi had turned Suribachi into a fortress, its entire base honeycombed with tunnels, its slopes studded with fighting positions. Progress was slow and costly. The Marines advanced yard by yard, using flamethrowers to burn out caves, using demolitions to collapse tunnel entrances, using rifles and grenades to silence machine gun nests. The Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, emerging from hidden positions to attack, then disappearing back into the mountain. Some positions could only be taken after hours of combat. A single cave might require an entire platoon to clear. The volcanic rock made digging foxholes nearly impossible. The Marines used shell craters where they could find them, piled rocks for protection, or simply lay flat against the slopes and prayed that the next shell or bullet would miss. Water was precious. The exertion of fighting in the heat, combined with the sulphurous air, left men desperately thirsty. Resupply was difficult. Carrying ammunition and water up those steep slopes, under fire, required extraordinary effort. By nightfall on the 20th, the 28th Marines had encircled the base of Mount Suribachi, but the mountain itself remained unconquered. That night brought the usual probing attacks, the infiltration attempts, the sudden eruptions of violence in the darkness. And in the morning, the assault would resume. Meanwhile, on the right flank, the 4th Division fought toward the 1st Airfield. This was Motoyama Airfield No. 1, the southernmost of the 3 Japanese airstrips. The Marines advanced across open ground, taking fire from Japanese positions on higher ground to the north. Machine guns swept the airfield. Mortars dropped with deadly accuracy. But gradually, building by building, crater by crater, the 4th Division pushed forward. By the 21st of February, 3 days into the battle, Marines had reached the edge of the airfield. Japanese resistance remained fierce. Every building had to be cleared. Every revetment concealed enemy soldiers. But the Marines were learning. They developed tactics for dealing with the complex defensive positions. Infantry supported tanks. Tanks supported infantry. Flamethrowers and demolitions cleared bunkers. Artillery and naval gunfire pounded suspected positions before assaults. The casualty rate remained appalling. Companies that had landed with 250 men were down to 150, 100, sometimes less. Platoons shrank to squads. Squads shrank to fire teams. Officers and NCOs fell at a frightening rate. They were obvious targets, and Japanese snipers were skilled marksmen. Replacements came forward from the reserve units, fresh-faced Marines who sometimes died within hours of reaching the front lines. On the 22nd, the 4th Division secured the 1st airfield. It was a significant milestone, but it brought no relief. Ahead lay the 2nd airfield, Motoyama Airfield No. 2, and beyond that, the formidable defenses of the Northern Highlands. And every yard gained meant more casualties, more men killed or wounded, more bodies to be carried back to the aid stations. That same day, the 28th Marines tightened their noose around Mount Suribachi. The mountain had been cut off from reinforcement. Naval gunfire had pounded its summit for days. Aircraft had bombed it relentlessly. But still the Japanese fought on, emerging from caves to fire and then vanishing back into the mountain's depths. The Marines could see the summit now, could see the crater rim, but reaching it would require another day of brutal close-quarters combat. The night of February 22nd passed without major incident, though the usual infiltration attempts kept Marines on edge. Everyone knew that the next day, the 23rd, would see an all-out effort to take Mount Suribachi's summit. Volunteers were called for. 40 Marines from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, stepped forward. Their leader would be 1st Lieutenant Harold Schreier, Executive Officer of Easy Company. At 0800 on February 23rd, the patrol began its ascent of Mount Suribachi. Part 6. The Flag Above Suribachi. The climb began slowly, cautiously. Lieutenant Schreier's patrol moved up the northern slope of Mount Suribachi, weapons ready, expecting ambush at every turn. But the resistance that morning was surprisingly light. A few shots from scattered positions, a grenade or two, nothing like the sustained fire that had greeted every previous advance. The lack of opposition might have suggested several things to the Marines making that climb. Perhaps the bombardment had finally broken Japanese resistance. Perhaps the defenders had withdrawn. Or perhaps, and this seems most likely based on what we know from captured Japanese documents and post-war interviews, the garrison on Suribachi, isolated from the main Japanese force for days and running low on ammunition and supplies, had simply been ground down to ineffectiveness. Many defenders had been killed in the preceding days of bombardment and combat. Those who survived were exhausted and knew that death was certain whether they fought in the next hour or the next day. Whatever the reason, Schreier's patrol reached the summit by 10:30 in the morning. Standing at the crater's rim, they could see the entire island spread below them. The beaches to the south, still crowded with men and equipment. The narrow waste where the island was cut in two. The 2nd and 3rd airfields to the north. And beyond, the highlands where the main Japanese defenses waited. One of the Marines in the patrol carried a small American flag, 54 inches by 28 inches. Schreier ordered it raised. Marines found a length of Japanese pipe, tied the flag to it, and raised it at the summit of Mount Suribachi. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Down on the beaches, Marines saw the flag and cheered. Ships offshore blew their horns and whistles. The sound echoed across the island. For 5 days, the Marines had fought and died on those black volcanic beaches. For 5 days, Mount Suribachi had looked down on them like a presence promising death. Now, at last, the summit was theirs. The flag flew, but what most people never learned, what wouldn't be widely known for decades, was that this wasn't the flag raising that would become famous. At the command post of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson saw the flag through binoculars and immediately had a thought. That flag was too small. It could barely be seen from the northern beaches where other Marine units were still fighting. The men up there, bleeding and dying in places like the Meat Grinder and Hill 382, needed to see something bigger, something that would tell them Suribachi had fallen. Johnson ordered another flag brought forward. This one, 96 inches by 56 inches, nearly twice as large. And he detailed several Marines to carry it to the summit and replace the smaller flag. Among those Marines were Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Private First Class René Gagnon, and Navy Corpsman Harold Schultz. For 71 years, one of these men would be misidentified in the famous photograph that was about to be taken. Climbing Mount Suribachi at the same time were 3 photographers. Marine Sergeant Bill Gnaust was shooting motion picture film. Marine Private First Class Bob Campbell had a still camera. And following them was Joe Rosenthal, a 32-year-old civilian photographer working for the Associated Press. Rosenthal had missed the first flag raising. He was still climbing the mountain when it happened. He had no idea he was about to take the most famous photograph of World War II. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the 6 men raised the second, larger flag, while others prepared to lower the first. Rosenthal, realizing something was about to happen, quickly positioned himself. He stacked some rocks to give himself a better vantage point. He aimed his speed graphic camera without using the viewfinder. There wasn't time. And when the Marines heaved the heavy flagpole upward, fighting a stiff wind that caught the fabric, Rosenthal pressed the shutter. He had no idea he had just taken what would become the most famous photograph of World War II. The image shows 6 figures straining to raise the flag, their bodies leaning into the effort, the stars and stripes billowing in the wind. The composition seems almost impossibly perfect. The angles, the arrangement of figures, the dramatic sweep of the flag. It captures not just a moment, but a feeling, a sense of collective effort and sacrifice. The photograph was processed, transmitted to the mainland, and published in newspapers across America 2 days later. The response was overwhelming. Here, at last, was an image that seemed to embody everything the war meant: courage, determination, sacrifice, triumph. Within days, it appeared on the front page of hundreds of newspapers, magazine covers, posters. It became the basis for a war bond drive that raised $26 billion. Rosenthal won the Pulitzer Prize for photography in May of 1945, just months after pressing that shutter. But here's what the photograph didn't show. While Americans celebrated this image of victory, the men in the photograph were still on Iwo Jima, still fighting, still dying. Of the 6 men who raised that flag on February 23rd, 3 would not live to see March. Sergeant Michael Strank was killed by friendly fire from American artillery on March 1st. Corporal Harlan Block died on March 1st from enemy machine gun fire. Private First Class Franklin Sousley was killed by a sniper on March 21st. They died never knowing that their image had become famous, never knowing that millions of Americans had seen them raising that flag. 3 men were pulled from the front lines while fighting still raged on Iwo Jima and sent home for a nationwide war bond tour. Hayes, Gagnon, and Navy Corpsman John Bradley. At the time, military officials believed all three had participated in the famous flag raising. They would not discover for 71 years that they had made a mistake, that it was Harold Schultz, not John Bradley, in that immortal photograph. But based on the information they had in 1945, they sent these three men to be paraded before crowds, given medals and accolades, treated as the embodiment of American victory. Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona's Gila River Reservation, found himself particularly uncomfortable with the attention. He would later tell reporters that he wasn't a hero. The heroes were the ones who didn't come back. The fact that Schultz, the actual sixth man in the photograph, remained unknown made Hayes's burden heavier. He was being celebrated for something while the real participants weren't even recognized. Hayes descended into alcoholism, haunted by memories of friends who had died while he survived to be celebrated for raising a flag. In newspaper interviews before his death, he spoke about the disconnect between what people thought the photograph meant and what he knew it had cost. He died in 1955 at age 32, found frozen in an irrigation ditch on the Gila River Indian Reservation. His story became the subject of songs, books, and films, including a 1961 Hollywood movie starring Tony Curtis. René Gagnon lived until 1979, working various jobs, often trading on his status as a flag raiser. He appeared at ceremonies and gave interviews, but friends and family later reported that he too struggled with the gap between public perception and private reality. The photograph had made him famous for a moment of triumph, but most of his life was lived in the shadow of that single day on Iwo Jima. Harold Schultz kept his participation in the flag raising a secret for most of his life. He lived until 1995 and rarely spoke about his wartime service. It wasn't until 2016, 21 years after his death, that the Marine Corps confirmed through photographic analysis that Schultz, not John Bradley as previously believed, was one of the 6 men in Rosenthal's photograph. He had been there, part of one of the most famous images in American history, and had chosen not to claim that recognition. There was also controversy. Some accused Rosenthal of staging the photograph. He denied it truthfully, but the accusation persisted. The fact that there had been 2 flag raisings confused matters. For years, even the identities of the men in the photograph were disputed. In 2016, 71 years after the fact, the Marine Corps confirmed that one man had been misidentified, not John Bradley, but Navy Corpsman Harold Schultz. None of this diminishes the photograph's power or its importance. Rosenthal's image became a symbol, a rallying cry. It inspired a sculpture, the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, dedicated in 1954. And it gave Americans in the final months of World War II something they desperately needed: hope. But back on Iwo Jima on February 23, 1945, the flag raising meant something simpler and more immediate to the Marines fighting below. It meant that Mount Suribachi had fallen. It meant that one major objective had been achieved. And it meant that perhaps, just perhaps, they would survive to see the end of this battle. 31 more days of fighting remained. Part 7. The Meat Grinder. With Mount Suribachi secured, all 3 Marine divisions could now turn their full attention northward. Ahead lay the heart of Kuribayashi's defenses, a complex network of fortifications in the northern highlands that would earn the collective name the Meat Grinder. The name, coined by Marines who fought there, wasn't battlefield hyperbole. It was grimly literal. Men went in. Few came out whole. The terrain itself was an enemy unlike anything the Marines had encountered on the southern beaches. Where the landing zones had been relatively flat expanses of volcanic sand, the north was a nightmare landscape carved by geological violence. Ravines cut deep into the rock, their sides steep and treacherous. Ridges rose sharply, offering commanding fields of fire in every direction. Sharp outcroppings of volcanic rock provided natural fortifications that the Japanese had enhanced with concrete and steel. Vegetation, scrubby bushes and twisted trees that had somehow found purchase in the volcanic soil, provided concealment, but also hid death. Every hill commanded approaches from multiple directions. Every ravine could conceal machine gun nests, mortar positions, or entire platoons of Japanese defenders waiting in caves. Every innocuous boulder might have a cave entrance behind it, leading to tunnels that connected to positions hundreds of yards away. The Japanese could appear, fire, and disappear into the earth like ghosts. And unlike the southern sector, where Marines could at least see Mount Suribachi and know their objective, here in the north, the objectives shifted constantly as new defensive positions revealed themselves. 3 terrain features dominated this killing ground. Hill 382, called Naidan Iwa by the Japanese. Turkey Knob, 600 yards south of 382. And the amphitheater, a natural bowl formed by the slopes around Turkey Knob. Together, they formed an interlocking defensive complex, so formidable that it would take weeks to subdue and would cost more American lives than any other sector of the island. Hill 382 was the highest point in the northern sector, rising to a height that offered observation over the entire island. From its summit, Japanese observers could see every Marine movement, could call in artillery fire on any concentration of troops, could direct defensive operations across multiple square miles of battlefield. The hill itself had been transformed into a fortress. Pillboxes dotted its slopes. Cave entrances, some natural, some blasted from the rock, honeycombed its sides. At or near its summit, the Japanese had constructed a radio and weather station, vital for coordinating the defense. Just southeast of this station stood an enormously large blockhouse that served as the headquarters of Colonel Chosaku Kaido, who commanded all artillery on Iwo Jima. From this position, Kaido could orchestrate the entire northern defense. Turkey Knob, so named by Marines because of its resemblance to the bird's profile when viewed from certain angles, housed a reinforced concrete communications center and observation post. This wasn't a hastily built structure, but an engineering marvel. Concrete walls several feet thick, steel reinforced, designed to withstand naval bombardment. From Turkey Knob, Japanese observers could see the approaches from the south and direct defensive fires with deadly precision. The position was further strengthened by the terrain around it. The amphitheater was nature's gift to defenders. This natural bowl, formed by the slopes descending from Turkey Knob and the surrounding ridges, created a perfect defensive position. The Japanese had fortified it with 3 tiers of defensive emplacements cut into the southern-facing slopes. Each tier contained pillboxes, trenches, and machine gun positions. The tiers were arranged so that if Marines assaulted one level, they would come under fire from the levels above and below. Tunnels connected the positions, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened sectors or withdraw to fight again from a different position. And all approaches to the amphitheater were covered by interlocking fields of machine gun and mortar fire. The 4th Marine Division drew the assignment of reducing this complex. It was, in many ways, a sentence to death or maiming for thousands of Marines. The division's commander, Major General Clifton Cates, knew what his men faced. Intelligence had provided some information about the fortifications, but intelligence reports, however detailed, could not convey the reality of fighting in such terrain against such defenses. The assault began on February 26th, 1 week after the initial landing. The pattern that would characterize the next 2 weeks was established immediately. Dawn would bring preparatory bombardment, artillery from Marine positions to the south, naval gunfire from ships offshore when weather permitted, airstrikes from carrier-based aircraft when they could identify targets through the smoke and dust. the bombardment would seem overwhelming. Explosions would carpet the hills. Smoke would obscure everything. Surely, Marines would think nothing could survive such punishment. Then the Marines would advance, often covered by tanks when the terrain permitted their use. Within yards, sometimes within dozens of yards, sometimes within 100 yards, they would run into a defensive position that the bombardment had barely touched. A pillbox with concrete walls 3 feet thick, its gun ports positioned to fire along the Marines' line of advance rather than directly at it, making the position nearly impossible to see until you were in its kill zone. A machine gun nest carved into solid rock, its crew sheltered in a cave that connected by tunnel to 3 other positions. A mortar team firing from a hidden position, then displacing through tunnels before counter-battery fire could find them. Each pillbox, each cave, each defensive position had to be reduced individually. There was no shortcut, no clever tactic that could bypass the need for close-quarters combat. Flamethrower teams would move forward, supported by riflemen who provided covering fire. The flamethrower operator, carrying 72 pounds of fuel and equipment, presenting an obvious and high-value target, would advance as close as possible to the enemy position. Then, at a range of about 30 yards, he would spray liquid fire through the gun ports or cave entrance. The flame, reaching temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, would fill the confined space, consuming oxygen, igniting everything flammable, cooking the defenders alive. It was brutal work. Flamethrower operators had one of the highest casualty rates of any combat specialty. Japanese defenders, recognizing the threat, concentrated fire on them. If the fuel tanks were hit, the operator would be engulfed in his own weapon's fire. Even if the initial spray succeeded, enemy soldiers sometimes emerged from positions that seemed cleared, shooting or throwing grenades before collapsing from their wounds. And while the flamethrower team worked on one position, they would often come under fire from other positions they couldn't see. Engineers followed with demolitions. Satchel charges, canvas bags packed with explosives, would be placed at cave entrances or against pillbox walls. The explosion would collapse the entrance, sealing the defenders inside, or destroy the structure entirely. But getting close enough to place the charges required courage that bordered on madness. Engineers had to cross open ground under fire, place their charges, light the fuse, and withdraw before the explosion. Many died in the attempt. Tanks, when they could maneuver in the rocky terrain, provided mobile firepower. Their 75mm guns could destroy some pillboxes with direct hits. Their machine guns could suppress enemy positions while infantry advanced. But tanks were vulnerable in this terrain. Japanese defenders had positioned anti-tank guns and mines at natural choke points. Tank crews learned to advance cautiously, working in coordination with infantry who could spot hidden threats. Even so, tanks were knocked out regularly, their crews killed or forced to evacuate burning vehicles under fire. 1st Battalion, 24th Marines entered the meat grinder complex on March 1st, 8 days into the battle. Their mission, outlined in Operation Order 1045, was ambitious. Drive between Hill 382 and the amphitheater, break through to the high ground beyond, and crack the Japanese defensive line. On paper, it was sound strategy. Identify the weak point in the enemy line, concentrate force there, achieve breakthrough, exploit success. In practice, it was hell. Able Company took the left flank of the battalion's advance, moving in the shadow of Hill 382. From the moment they jumped off, they came under fire from Japanese positions on the hill's slopes. Machine guns fired from caves that were invisible until their muzzle flashes gave them away. Mortars dropped with frightening accuracy, their crews having pre-registered every likely assembly area and approach route. Artillery shells from positions beyond Hill 382 exploded among the advancing Marines with a regularity that suggested the Japanese could see everything. The volcanic rock made cover almost impossible to find. Unlike soil, which could be dug, the rock resisted entrenching tools. Marines could scrape out shallow depressions, could crouch behind boulders, could use shell craters when they found them. But true cover, protection that could stop bullets and fragments, was rare. The rock itself became a hazard. Every explosion sent showers of stone fragments flying. Men were wounded by these rock splinters as often as by metal shrapnel. Some wounds were superficial cuts, others were severe, rock fragments driven deep into flesh, shattering bones, penetrating vital organs. Charlie Company advanced on the right flank, heading straight for Turkey Knob. The concrete communications bunker that crowned the knob had become an obsession for the Marines. Its very existence seemed to mock them. They could see it, could identify it as a key position, but seemed unable to destroy it. Flamethrower teams pumped 1,000 gallons of fuel into its firing slits over the course of several days. The flames would rush in, would seem to fill the structure with fire, and then would dissipate. Minutes later, fire would emerge from the bunker again. Tank crews hit it with direct rounds from 75mm guns. The shells would strike the concrete, would explode, would chip away fragments of the outer wall. But the structure held. Marines began to joke bitterly about Turkey Knob. They called it the blockhouse that wouldn't die. They speculated about what it would take to destroy it. Bigger guns? Bigger bombs? Perhaps a direct hit from a battleship's 16-inch guns? Some suggested bypassing it entirely, letting it sit there while they advanced past, dealing with it later. But military doctrine and tactical reality said otherwise. You couldn't advance with a strong enemy position at your back, able to fire on your rear areas and supply lines. Turkey Knob had to fall. Between Able and Charlie companies, Baker Company tried to push through the center of the battalion's zone. Their mission was to be the spearhead, the unit that would achieve the breakthrough the operation order called for. Instead, they found themselves in a killing ground where every yard of advance came at the cost of casualties they could not afford. Machine gun fire from Hill 382 raked their left flank. Artillery from positions beyond Turkey Knob pounded their right. And mortars, those high-angle weapons that could drop shells almost vertically into positions that seemed sheltered, fell on them from positions the Marines couldn't even see. By the end of that first day, March 1st, Charlie Company alone had lost 27 Marines killed or wounded. Progress was measured in dozens of yards, purchased with blood. The terrain they had gained gave them no tactical advantage, just different positions from which to be killed. And everyone knew that the next day would be worse, because now the Japanese knew exactly where they were, could adjust their defensive fires accordingly, could prepare for the next American advance. On March 2nd, the assault continued. Division staff, studying maps and trying to understand why progress was so slow, decided on a different approach. Instead of trying to push straight through between Hill 382 and the amphitheater, which was clearly not working, the Marines would change direction. They would advance down a natural ravine that ran roughly northeast from Hill 382. The ravine would provide some cover from flanking fire. It would allow the Marines to get closer to the Japanese positions before being detected. It would, the planners hoped, achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them on March 1st. The reality, as so often happens in war, differed from the plan. The ravine did provide some cover from direct fire, but it was also a natural avenue of approach, which meant the Japanese had prepared for exactly this eventuality. Mines had been planted along the ravine floor. Machine guns on the ridges above could fire straight down into it, and the Japanese had positioned observers who could call in mortar fire the moment Marines entered the ravine in any strength. Private First Class Norman Lucas, a mortarman with Charlie Company, had been on Iwo Jima for less than 2 weeks, but it felt like a lifetime. He had enlisted at 16, lying about his age, driven by the newsreels he'd seen about Pearl Harbor and Wake Island. Boot camp at Camp Elliott had seemed difficult at the time. Now it seemed like paradise. At least in boot camp, the drill instructors weren't trying to kill you. Lucas and his mortar crew moved forward with the infantry, carrying the tube and base plate and high explosive rounds, all of it adding up to impossible weight that had to be manhandled across terrain that resisted every step. Their mission was to provide indirect fire support, to drop 60mm mortar rounds on Japanese positions that the infantry couldn't reach with direct fire. But to do that effectively, they needed to be relatively close to the front lines, close enough that they were constantly under fire themselves. Years later, trying to explain what it was like to his children and grandchildren, Lucas would struggle for words. How do you describe the fear? The knowledge that at any instant, a bullet or shell fragment could end your life. The exhaustion so complete that you could fall asleep despite the noise, despite the danger, because your body simply shut down. The grief of watching friends die? The guilt of surviving when they didn't? The gradual numbing that happened when death became so common that you stopped reacting to it emotionally, just registered it factually, and moved on because there was no other choice? The fighting in and around the meat grinder continued day after day, week after week. Small unit actions that would have been significant battles on their own became mere footnotes in the larger story. A platoon would assault a cave system, would spend hours clearing it, would lose half its strength doing so. A company would take a ridgeline, would hold it against counterattacks through the night, would resume the advance at dawn with perhaps half the men it had started with. Squad leaders became platoon commanders when the lieutenant was killed. Sergeants led companies when all the officers were casualties. Private first class took over squads because there was no one else left with the experience or the will to lead. 1st Battalion, 25th Marines, fighting in the amphitheater, developed a routine that was almost mechanical in its repetition, though no less deadly for that. Each morning would begin with preparatory fires, then the assault. Frontal attacks against positions that were almost impossible to approach. Marines would advance, would take casualties, would get close enough to the Japanese positions to use grenades and flamethrowers, would kill the defenders at terrible cost. Then they would discover that the position they had just taken was connected by tunnels to other positions, and Japanese soldiers would appear behind them, would attack, would force them to fight for ground they thought they had already secured. By nightfall, exhausted and depleted, they would fall back to their starting positions. The next morning, they would do it again. Major Fenton Mee, commanding the battalion, watched his unit being ground down and knew he had to try something different. The bombardment and assault routine wasn't working. The Japanese had learned to take shelter during the bombardment, then emerge when the Marines advanced. What if the Marines attacked without the bombardment? What if they tried to achieve surprise by hitting the Japanese before they expected it? On the morning of March 3rd, Mee launched a double envelopment of Turkey Knob. The plan required precise timing and absolute coordination. 2 assault forces would advance simultaneously from different directions, would converge on the knob, would trap the defenders between them. If it worked, they could eliminate 2 of the major strong points in the meat grinder and spare themselves another day of frontal assaults that accomplished nothing. The attack began before dawn, without preparatory fires. Marines moved through the darkness as quietly as possible, which wasn't very quiet given the gear they carried and the terrain they had to cross. But it was quiet enough. They achieved tactical surprise. The 2 assault forces converged, came within 65 yards of linking up and completing the envelopment. For a moment, it seemed the plan had worked. Then Japanese artillery from positions beyond the amphitheater opened up. Someone, a forward observer who had spotted the movement despite the darkness, or perhaps someone who had heard the advance and called in pre-registered defensive fires, had alerted the artillery. Shells began falling on both assault forces. Without the natural protection of being able to advance under cover of their own bombardment, the Marines were caught exposed. Casualties mounted quickly. The two forces, unable to complete the link-up under such fire, withdrew. The gap remained open. Turkey Knob remained in Japanese hands. The psychological toll of such fighting defied measurement. Every Marine in the meat grinder was exhausted, physically and mentally. They weren't getting enough sleep, a few hours snatched here and there between attacks and defensive preparations. They weren't getting enough food. Rations came forward when they could, but often supplies were interrupted by Japanese fire. They weren't getting enough water. The island had no natural sources, and every drop had to be brought forward, and there was never enough. They were living in constant filth. The volcanic ash and dust covered everything, got into clothes and boots and weapons, abraded skin, made simple acts like eating or drinking gritty experiences. And they were fighting an enemy who never seemed to diminish, who could not be seen except when attacking, who could hit you from any direction at any time. This bred a special kind of exhaustion, a stress that wore men down in ways that pure physical exertion could not. Men developed what was then called battle fatigue, or combat exhaustion, what we now recognize as combat-related post-traumatic stress. They would freeze during attacks, unable to move. They would break down crying. Some would become irrationally aggressive, taking suicidal risks. Others would become nearly catatonic, staring blankly at nothing. Navy corpsmen and Marine officers tried to help these men. Sometimes a few hours of sleep in a rear area would help. Sometimes medication, usually just morphine or sedatives, would take the edge off the worst symptoms. But often, these men simply couldn't continue. They would be evacuated, marked as psychiatric casualties, sent to hospital ships where psychiatrists would try to put them back together. Many would recover enough to return to duty. Others never would. By March 8th, after more than a week of continuous combat in the meat grinder, the Marines had finally secured Hill 382 and Turkey Knob. The amphitheater had been cleared. The Japanese had been pushed back, had abandoned these positions under cover of darkness and withdrawn to new defensive lines further north. The 4th Marine Division had achieved its objectives, but the cost was almost unbearable to contemplate. Companies that had landed with 250 men now counted 50 or 60 effectives. Some platoons had been reduced to squad strength. Squads that should have had 13 men might have 4 or 5. The turnover in junior officers and NCOs, sergeants and corporals, was appalling. Companies went through multiple commanders as lieutenants and captains were killed or wounded. Platoons burned through leaders at an even faster rate. And the end was not yet in sight. Ahead lay more hills, more ridges, more defensive positions that would have to be taken, one by one. The meat grinder had been the worst, but the rest of the Northern Highlands would demand more sacrifice before the island could be declared secure. Part 8. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. In the midst of the slaughter, acts of extraordinary heroism became almost routine. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz would later say of Iwo Jima, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue." It was more than rhetoric. The battle produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single engagement in American history. 14 of those medals were awarded to Marines, 5 went to Navy personnel, mostly corpsmen, and 13, nearly half, were posthumous awards, given to men who had sacrificed their lives for their comrades. Consider Sergeant Darrell Cole of the 5th Marine Division. On D-Day, February 19th, Cole led his machine gun section ashore on Red Beach. His unit immediately came under heavy fire from Japanese pillboxes. Cole, armed only with a pistol and grenades, single-handedly assaulted the first pillbox, destroying it with grenades. He then spotted a second pillbox and attacked it the same way. Then a third. He had just destroyed a fourth pillbox when he was killed by a grenade. His actions had cleared a path for his company to advance inland. He was 24 years old. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Consider Corporal Tony Stein, also of the 5th Division. Stein had fabricated his own weapon, a machine gun taken from a downed aircraft and modified to be carried by one man. He called it his Stinger. On D-Day, Stein made 8 separate trips back to the beach to get more ammunition for his weapon, each time covering his unit's advance with devastating suppressive fire. He personally killed 20 Japanese soldiers. On his ammunition runs, he carried wounded Marines back to the aid stations. On his last trip, he borrowed a rifle and helped another Marine clear a bunker. 3 weeks later, on March 1st, Tony Stein was killed by enemy fire. He was 23. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Consider Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone. His story is about a choice that didn't have to be made. Basilone was already a Marine legend when Iwo Jima was being planned. He had earned the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal in 1942, personally killing 38 Japanese soldiers during a night-long defense of Henderson Field. When one of his machine guns jammed, he cleared it with his bare hands, receiving burns that scarred his hands permanently. When ammunition ran low, he ran through enemy fire to bring more forward. He held his position through waves of Japanese attacks that should have overwhelmed it. The Marine Corps brought him home, gave him a war bond tour, sent him to parades where crowds cheered him as a hero, offered him a commission. He could have become an officer, could have spent the rest of the war training recruits stateside. He could have lived. He had already done more than his share, earned his Medal of Honor, served his country beyond any reasonable expectation. John Basilone said no. He wanted to return to his men. He wanted to go back to combat. The Corps tried to dissuade him. His superiors argued that he was worth more alive, inspiring bond purchases and inspiring recruits, than dead on some Pacific beach. Basilone insisted. In September 1944, he got his wish. He was assigned to the 27th Marines, 5th Division, as a machine gun section leader. So on February 19, 1945, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, Medal of Honor recipient, the man who could have stayed home, landed on Iwo, Jima's beaches with his men. He led his machine gun section ashore through that volcanic sand that trapped vehicles and swallowed footsteps. His section immediately came under heavy fire from Japanese pillboxes. Basilone moved forward. He personally destroyed a pillbox with grenades and demolitions. When a Marine tank became trapped in the volcanic sand, surrounded by mines, Basilone guided it to safety, walking ahead of the tank, under fire, directing the driver through a safe path. He then led an assault on a Japanese blockhouse, clearing it with grenades. Shortly after, a Japanese mortar round exploded near him. John Basilone died on the beach he had fought to secure. He was 28 years old. The Marine Corps awarded him the Navy Cross posthumously, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, added to the Medal of Honor he already held. He had chosen to be there, could have been safe, could have lived, chose instead to go back to his men, to lead them one more time, and died on the first day of the battle he didn't have to fight. Consider Private First Class Jacklyn Lucas. This story begins with a lie that would save lives. Lucas was 14 years old when he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station in 1942 and lied about his age. 14, not 16, not 17, 14 years old, claiming to be 17. The recruiters either believed him or chose not to ask too many questions. America needed Marines, and Lucas wanted to be one. He made it through boot camp. He trained. He shipped out to the Pacific. But by February 1945, when the 5th Division prepared to assault Iwo Jima, Lucas had accumulated enough disciplinary infractions that his commanders assigned him to a rear area unit. He would stay on the transport ships while the assault troops went ashore. It was probably a relief to his superiors. This kid who had lied his way into the Marines would be kept safe. Lucas had other ideas. On the night before the invasion, he stowed away aboard a transport ship bound for the battle. When discovered, he was placed under arrest. But he was already there, already among the assault troops, and when the landing craft loaded up on D-Day, Lucas went ashore with them. He was 17 years old by then, still technically too young to be in combat, but no longer the child who had first enlisted. On February 20th, the day after the landing, Lucas found himself in a trench with 3 other Marines when 2 Japanese grenades landed among them. What went through his mind in that instant, we can't know with certainty, but what he did is a matter of record, witnessed by those who survived. Without hesitation, Lucas threw himself on top of both grenades. One grenade exploded, tearing through his body. By all accounts and medical understanding, that should have killed him. The second grenade, by some inexplicable mercy, did not detonate. The 3 Marines Lucas had shielded survived. Lucas, himself, against all odds and medical probability, also survived, though with severe wounds that would require extensive hospitalization. He was 17 years old when he received the Medal of Honor, making him the youngest Marine ever to earn the nation's highest decoration for valor. He would live until 2008, dying at age 80, having spent 63 years as the teenager who jumped on 2 grenades. Consider Captain Robert Dunlap of the 5th Division. On February 20th and 21st, Dunlap led his company through intense combat near the base of Mount Suribachi. When his Marines came under withering machine gun fire from multiple pillboxes, Dunlap personally led assault teams against each position. He destroyed 1 pillbox with a bazooka. He cleared another with grenades. He directed tank fire against a third, all while under constant enemy fire. His actions allowed his company to advance and establish defensive positions. Dunlap survived the battle and received the Medal of Honor in person. Consider Corporal Herschel Woody Williams. His story exemplifies how sometimes the most dangerous jobs fall to the smallest men. Williams was a demolitions specialist with the 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed about 130 pounds soaking wet. In the Marines, where physical size often determined assignments, Williams had been told he was too small to carry the heavy flamethrower equipment. The M22 flamethrower, standard Marine issue, weighed about 68 pounds when fully loaded with fuel. Add the protective gear, the supporting equipment, and you were asking a man to carry nearly his own body weight into combat. Williams convinced his superiors to let him try. He trained relentlessly with the flamethrower, building the upper body strength needed to wield it effectively. He studied the tactics of flamethrower use, understanding that this weapon, while devastating, also made you a priority target. Japanese soldiers had learned to recognize flamethrower operators, the distinctive equipment, the posture required to operate it, and they would focus fire on these men, knowing that killing a flamethrower operator often meant setting off a spectacular and demoralizing explosion as the fuel tanks ignited. On February 23, 1945, the same day the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi, Williams's battalion ran into a network of pillboxes that had the entire unit pinned down. These weren't hastily constructed positions. They were reinforced concrete bunkers, each covering the others, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that made approach from any direction suicidal. The battalion had already taken heavy casualties trying to advance. Officers were calling for more time, for additional support, for anything that might reduce the cost of taking these positions. Williams volunteered. He would go forward with his flamethrower, covered by 4 riflemen. Just 5 men attempting what an entire battalion couldn't achieve. His commander tried to dissuade him. The odds of survival seemed vanishingly small. Williams insisted. "Someone had to do it," he said. "It might as well be him." For 4 hours, Williams operated in what can only be described as sustained madness. He would identify a pillbox, plan an approach, then advance while his 4 covering riflemen tried to suppress any Japanese fire they could see. He would get close to a position, often within yards, well within the effective range of the machine guns firing at him, and then spray flame into the firing slits. The flame would pour into the bunker, filling it with burning fuel, sucking the oxygen from the air, creating temperatures that no human could survive. Then he would move to the next pillbox, and the next. 7 times Williams advanced on fortified positions. 7 times he sprayed flame into concrete bunkers. 7 times he survived the return fire that killed or wounded Marines around him. At one point, his flamethrower malfunctioned, a potentially fatal problem that would leave him immobile, exposed, unable to fight or run. Under fire, Williams calmly disassembled part of the weapon, cleared the blockage, reassembled it, and continued fighting. When his flamethrower finally ran out of fuel, Williams had destroyed 7 pillboxes and eliminated the positions that had pinned down his battalion. The unit could advance. The cost in American lives had been minimized because one small man with a flamethrower had been willing to do what most men would consider suicidal. Williams survived the battle. He survived the war. He would live until June 29, 2022, dying at age 98 as one of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. In his later years, Williams would speak at schools, at military events, at ceremonies honoring veterans. He always insisted that he wasn't the hero. The heroes, he said, were the men who didn't come home. The 4 riflemen who covered him that day, 2 of whom would die on Iwo Jima before the battle ended. The Marines in the battalion who had been saved by his actions, but who wouldn't survive the weeks of combat that followed. Consider pharmacist's mate 2nd Class George Wallen of the Navy. The story of corpsmen on Iwo Jima deserves special attention, for these were men who went into combat unarmed, who faced the same dangers as the Marines they served, but who were bound by medical ethics and military regulation to heal rather than harm. Navy corpsmen were assigned to Marine units at a ratio of approximately 1 corpsman for every 30 Marines. They carried medical supplies: bandages, morphine syringes, plasma, tourniquets, sulfur powder, instead of weapons. They were trained in emergency medicine, in trauma care, in the difficult calculus of triage, where you had to decide who could be saved, who needed immediate attention, and who was beyond help. And they were absolutely essential. Marines knew that when they were hit, when they went down screaming, a corpsman would come, would risk his own life to save theirs. The Japanese knew this too, and many Japanese soldiers, though operating under their own ethical codes about combat, learned to call out corpsman to draw these medical personnel into ambushes. It was psychological warfare of a particularly brutal sort, exploiting the corpsman's dedication to saving lives to make them targets. Despite knowing this tactic was being used, corpsmen continued to respond to calls for help. Their oath, their training, their essential decency wouldn't allow them to do otherwise. George Wallen was 20 years old on Iwo Jima. He had enlisted in the Navy in 1943, volunteered for corpsman training, and been assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines. From the moment his unit landed, Wallen was in motion, treating casualties. The beaches on D-Day were a corpsman's nightmare. Wounded men everywhere, more casualties coming in every minute, inadequate supplies, no shelter from ongoing enemy fire. Wallen moved among the wounded, making rapid assessments, administering morphine to those in severe pain, applying pressure bandages to stop bleeding, calling for stretcher bearers to evacuate those who needed immediate surgery. On March 3rd, Wallen's battalion was fighting in the Northern Highlands, pushing toward one of the defensive positions that would later be called part of the meat grinder complex. A Marine was hit, went down in an exposed position, began screaming for help. The nearest cover was 30 yards away. Between the wounded Marine and that cover lay open ground swept by Japanese machine gun fire. Several Marines had already been hit trying to reach the wounded man. Wallen didn't hesitate. He crawled forward, staying as low to the ground as possible, while machine gun bullets cracked overhead and kicked up spurts of volcanic dust around him. He reached the wounded Marine, saw immediately that the injury was serious, a sucking chest wound that would be fatal without immediate treatment. Under fire, Wallen applied a pressure dressing, administered morphine, and prepared the Marine for movement. Then, with help from another Marine who had crawled forward, Wallen dragged the wounded man back to cover. Both men were hit by fragments during the evacuation. Wallen's wounds were minor, painful, but not immediately debilitating. He refused evacuation, refused even to have his wounds properly dressed until he had finished treating the Marine he had just saved. Over the next 3 days, Wallen was wounded 3 more times. A machine gun bullet creased his side. Fragments from a mortar round peppered his left arm. Another bullet struck him in the leg. Each time, he refused evacuation. His battalion needed every corpsman they had, and Wallen was determined to keep working as long as he could still move. He continued treating casualties, moving forward with the advancing Marines, going back to help wounded men in rear areas, working sometimes for 18 or 20 hours straight with minimal rest. On March 5th, a Marine in Wallen's unit stepped on a mine in an area that was suspected but not confirmed to be mined. The explosion shattered the Marine's leg and left him wounded in the middle of a minefield. Other Marines could see him, could hear him calling for help, but approaching meant risking setting off more mines. The safe choice would have been to wait, to bring up engineers with mine detectors, to clear a path systematically. That would have taken hours. The wounded Marine might not survive hours. Wallen crawled into the minefield. He didn't have detection equipment. He didn't have training in mine clearance. What he had was the knowledge that a Marine was suffering and needed help. He crawled forward slowly, carefully, feeling ahead with his hands, distributing his weight as evenly as possible, hoping that his lighter frame might not be enough to trigger pressure-detonated mines. He reached the wounded Marine, applied a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, administered morphine, and then, with help from another Marine who had followed him into the minefield, carried the wounded man back out. By some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, neither Wallen nor his helper triggered any additional mines. After 5 days of continuous action, after being wounded 4 separate times, Wallen finally collapsed from blood loss, exhaustion, and infection. He was evacuated to a hospital ship, treated, and survived. In October 1945, several months after the war ended, President Harry Truman presented Wallen with the Medal of Honor. Wallen would live until August 2014, dying at age 94, having spent his post-war life working as a veterans counselor, helping other combat veterans deal with the psychological and physical wounds of warfare. These stories represent only a fraction of the heroism displayed on Iwo Jima. Every day brought similar acts: men throwing themselves on grenades to save comrades, corpsmen braving fire to reach wounded Marines, riflemen assaulting pillboxes alone when no one else would, officers leading from the front, absorbing the first enemy fire. It happened so often that it became almost expected, a grim calculus where extraordinary courage was the minimum requirement for survival. But heroism alone could not make the battle less terrible. The Marines kept dying. The casualty figures kept climbing. And General Kuribayashi's garrison, though steadily ground down, kept fighting with the same desperate determination. Part 9. The final weeks. By mid-March, the character of the battle had changed. The Marines controlled most of the island. The second and third airfields had been captured. The Japanese had been pushed into an ever-shrinking pocket in the northern tip of the island. But they had not been defeated. They simply fought on from caves and tunnels, emerging at night to attack, disappearing at dawn into positions the Marines struggled to find. General Kuribayashi, still alive and still commanding from his underground headquarters, had long since abandoned any hope of victory. His goal now was simply to delay the inevitable, to kill as many Americans as possible before the end. He forbade suicidal banzai charges. They were wasteful of life and accomplished nothing. Instead, his remaining troops conducted small-scale raids, attacked supply lines, and defended their positions with the same grim determination they had shown since the beginning. The Marines developed specialized tactics for reducing the final Japanese positions. Teams combined infantry, engineers, and tanks. Flamethrower tanks, armored vehicles mounting flame weapons, proved particularly effective against cave positions. Engineers placed demolition charges to collapse tunnel entrances. Infantry cleared surface positions. Slowly, methodically, the Marines compressed the Japanese into an ever smaller area. On March 14th, Marine aircraft began flying from the captured airfields, the first time American planes had operated from Japanese home islands territory. On March 16th, the island was officially declared secure, though fighting continued. Admiral Nimitz announced victory. But Marines still died every day clearing the remaining Japanese holdouts. Kuribayashi knew the end was near. On March 17th, he prepared what would be his final message to Imperial headquarters. The radio transmission, intercepted and translated by American intelligence, carried the formal, restrained tone expected of a Japanese general officer, but the meaning was clear. The battle is entering its final chapter. Since the enemy's landing, even the gods would weep at the bravery of the officers and men under my command. In particular, I am deeply moved by the fighting spirit of my officers and men who have defended their positions with devotion, even though they are outnumbered. I fear we will not be able to hold out much longer. I am very sorry indeed that I have not been able to fulfill my duty as I should have. I am going to fight to the end with about 400 of my officers and men. I bid farewell to all of you forever. On the night of March 25th into the early morning of March 26th, General Kuribayashi organized what Japanese records suggest was a final attack, though calling it an attack almost misrepresents what it was. This wasn't a banzai charge, not the screaming, disordered rush that had characterized Japanese last stands elsewhere in the Pacific. Based on American after-action reports and the few Japanese accounts that exist, it appears to have been a carefully planned infiltration, aimed at American rear areas, executed in near silence by approximately 300 soldiers who knew they were about to die. The attack fell primarily on units of the 7th Fighter Command, Army Air Force personnel who were occupying the captured airfields. These airmen, trained as pilots and mechanics rather than infantry, fought back as best they could against an enemy that had seemingly materialized from the darkness. The battle was confused, brutal, close quarters. Men fought hand to hand. When dawn came, the attack had been repulsed. Nearly 200 Japanese lay dead. General Kuribayashi's body was never found among the dead, never identified, never recovered. What happened to him in those final hours remains one of the genuine mysteries of the battle. Examining the available evidence, American after-action reports, Japanese accounts that surfaced after the war, the testimony of the few Japanese survivors, most historians have concluded he most likely died leading that final attack. This interpretation fits with his character as documented in his letters, his determination expressed in his final radio message to fight alongside his men, and the Japanese military tradition of commanders sharing the fate of their troops. However, some Japanese sources suggest an alternative possibility, that he may have performed seppuku, ritual suicide, in his underground command bunker after sending his men forward for that final attack. This too would align with samurai tradition for a commander facing inevitable defeat. The truth is that we simply don't know with certainty. No eyewitness accounts definitively place him in either location at the moment of his death. His body was never recovered for identification. What we can say with confidence is that he kept his word, documented in his final message. He fought until the end, making the Americans pay for every yard of that volcanic rock. The Marines continued mopping up operations for weeks after the island was declared secure. Japanese holdouts remained in caves throughout the northern sector. Some surrendered. Most fought to the death. A few would survive for months or even years, hiding in the island's extensive tunnel network. The last 2 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima surrendered in January 1949, nearly 4 years after the battle ended. By the time organized resistance finally ceased, the casualty figures were staggering. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive during the battle. Another 867 would surrender in the months following. The rest, more than 95% of the garrison, died fighting. American casualties were equally appalling. The Marines suffered 6,821 killed in action, died of wounds, or missing and presumed dead. Another 19,217 were wounded. The Navy lost 880 personnel, mostly to kamikaze attacks on the ships offshore. Total American casualties exceeded 26,000, more than a third of the assault force. It was the only Pacific battle in which American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties, though Japanese combat deaths were still 3 times higher than American deaths. The cost in human terms was almost incomprehensible. Entire companies ceased to exist as fighting units. The 4th Marine Division, which had borne the brunt of the fighting in the meat grinder, suffered 75% casualties in some rifle companies. The 5th Division lost similar numbers. The 3rd Division, committed later in the battle, fared somewhat better but still took terrible losses. And the question that would haunt veterans and historians for generations remained: had it been worth it? And Part 10. Was it necessary? The justification for Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima, rested on several pillars. First, the island provided a base for Japanese fighters that harassed American bombers and bases in the Marianas. Second, its radar installations gave early warning of every American air raid on Japan. Third, and most importantly, its airfields could serve as emergency landing sites for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on the Japanese home islands. Of these justifications, the third, the emergency landing argument, became the most prominent after the battle. The sight of massive, expensive B-29s landing on Iwo Jima's captured airfields seemed to validate the sacrifice. The first emergency landing occurred on March 4th, while fighting still raged on the island. A B-29 named Dynamite, low on fuel after a bombing mission over Tokyo, touched down on Motoyama Airfield No. 1. The pilot, Lieutenant Fred Marlowe, radioed ahead, "We're coming in with battle damage and low on fuel." Marines fighting nearby watched the huge bomber land, get refueled and serviced, and take off the next day. By the war's end in August, 2,251 B-29 landings had been recorded on Iwo Jima's airfields. With each bomber carrying a crew of 11, simple arithmetic suggested that Iwo Jima had saved nearly 25,000 airmen's lives. Lives that would have been lost if those damaged aircraft had been forced to ditch in the Pacific Ocean. This calculation became the standard justification for the battle. It appeared in official reports, in newspaper articles, in speeches by military leaders. The sacrifice of 7,000 Marines, the argument went, had saved 25,000 airmen. It was terrible arithmetic, but it made sense. Wars required such calculations. But in 2004, nearly 60 years after the battle, a historian named Robert Burrell published research that challenged this comfortable narrative. Captain Burrell, then a history instructor at the United States Naval Academy, had spent years examining records of every B-29 landing on Iwo Jima. What he discovered was troubling. Of those 2,251 landings, his research suggested that only a small fraction were genuine emergencies. Aircraft that would have crashed into the ocean without Iwo Jima's airfields. The vast majority, his data indicated, were routine refueling stops, minor maintenance checks, or training flights. During June 1945, which saw the highest number of landings, Burrell found that none of the more than 800 B-29s that touched down on Iwo Jima did so because of combat damage. They landed to top off their fuel tanks, to check engines, to give crews a break. These were convenience stops, not life or death emergencies. Burrell suggested something that many veterans found painful, that the emergency landing justification became prominent only after the Marines had paid such a terrible price to capture the island. The need to justify the losses, to make sense of all those deaths, led to what he characterized as an inflated narrative about the island's importance. Moreover, he noted a fact that military planners would have known. B-29 crews that ditched at sea had about a 50% survival rate thanks to air-sea rescue operations that were already in place. Even if Iwo Jima had not been captured, and even if all those supposedly emergency landings had resulted in ditching, the potential losses would have been around 12,500 aircrew, not 25,000. Still a significant number, but not the overwhelming justification that had been presented. Other historians added their own doubts to the accepted narrative. The Japanese radar on Iwo Jima had provided early warning. True, but radar on the nearby island of Rota, which was never invaded, continued to provide the same service throughout the war. The threat from Iwo Jima-based fighters was real in late 1944, but by the time the invasion occurred in February, the Japanese had pulled most aircraft back to defend Okinawa and the home islands. The fighter threat had already diminished significantly. The P-51 Mustang fighters that were supposed to escort B-29s from Iwo Jima, one of the primary justifications for the invasion, flew only 10 such missions during the war. The concept proved less practical than planners had hoped. So was the battle necessary? The question has no easy answer. Some veterans insist that every B-29 saved justified the cost. They point to the airmen who walked away from emergency landings and lived because Iwo Jima's airfields were there. They note that air-sea rescue operations based on the island saved dozens of bomber crews shot down over Japan. They argue that the psychological impact on Japan, seeing an island of their homeland fall, was significant. Others argue that the strategic value was overstated, that alternative strategies could have achieved the same results at lower cost. Admiral William Leahy, President Truman's chief of staff, later wrote that Iwo Jima was a mistake that cost too many lives for too little strategic gain. Some historians suggest that bypassing Iwo Jima, leaving its garrison isolated and ineffective while focusing on larger objectives, would have been wiser. The debate continues. What cannot be debated is the sacrifice of those who fought there. Whether necessary or not, whether justified or not, the battle happened. 7,000 Americans died. 21,000 Japanese died. And the island that had been fought over so fiercely stands today as a reminder of the costs of war. But there's another cost that the official casualty figures don't capture. a cost that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. The psychological toll, the wounds that don't show up in medical records. The men who survived physically but carried Iwo Jima with them for the rest of their lives. In 1945, military medicine didn't have a name for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They called it battle fatigue, or combat exhaustion, or shell shock. Whatever the name, the condition was common on Iwo Jima. Marines who had functioned effectively for days or weeks would suddenly break. Some would freeze in combat, unable to move or respond to orders. Others would become hyper-aggressive, taking unnecessary risks, as if seeking death. Still others would simply stop, staring blankly, unresponsive, having retreated into some internal space where the horror couldn't reach them. The psychiatric casualties from Iwo Jima numbered in the hundreds, though exact figures are difficult to determine because record-keeping for mental health issues was inconsistent. Many men who showed signs of psychological trauma were never officially classified as casualties. They were simply rotated to rear areas, given a few days of rest, and sent back to their units. The ones who broke completely, who could no longer function, were evacuated to hospital ships and eventually to psychiatric facilities in Hawaii or the continental United States. Dr. William Menninger, who served as chief consultant in neuropsychiatry to the Surgeon General during World War II, would later write about the psychological impact of battles like Iwo Jima. The intensity of combat, the duration of stress, the constant proximity to death. These factors created conditions where even the most resilient men could break. On Iwo Jima, Marines fought for 36 days without meaningful respite. There was no rear area where one could rest safely. Japanese artillery could reach any part of the island. The beaches, which should have been safe zones, remained under observation and fire throughout the battle. There was quite literally no escape from the stress of combat, except death, serious wounds, or complete psychological collapse. The men who survived and returned home brought Iwo Jima with them in ways their families often couldn't understand. Veterans reported nightmares that would wake them screaming decades after the war ended. Loud noises, thunder, fireworks, backfiring cars would trigger panic attacks. Some developed what we would now recognize as hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats, unable to relax even in safe environments. Others experienced survivors' guilt so profound that it shaped their entire post-war lives. One Marine, interviewed in the 1980s for an oral history project, described visiting the grave of a friend who had died on Iwo Jima. "I still don't understand why he died and I lived," the Marine said, his voice breaking. "We were standing right next to each other when the shell hit. He went down, I stayed up. Why? What made me special? What made me worth saving when he wasn't?" This question, variations of which appear in countless veteran testimonies, has no answer. Combat is random. Shells and bullets don't select targets based on merit or worthiness. But survivors often struggle with this randomness, searching for meaning in events that have no meaning beyond the terrible mathematics of high explosives and human bodies. The physical wounds, at least, were more straightforward. The Navy and Marine Corps medical establishment had developed sophisticated trauma care by 1945. Corpsmen at the front lines could stabilize casualties. Aid stations provided emergency surgery. Hospital ships offered facilities that rivaled civilian hospitals. Many Marines who would have died in earlier wars survived because of advances in blood transfusion, antibiotics, techniques. But surviving wasn't the same as recovering. Thousands of Marines left Iwo Jima with injuries that would affect them for life. Amputees had to adjust to prosthetics, learn new ways of doing tasks that had once been automatic. Men with traumatic brain injuries from shell concussions dealt with headaches, memory problems, personality changes. Those with severe burns faced years of painful skin grafts and reconstructive surgery. The lucky ones, and lucky is relative, had injuries that healed cleanly and left them functional, if not quite whole. The broader social and military implications of Iwo Jima extended far beyond the immediate battle. The casualty rates shocked American military planners and the public. Newspapers published the figures: 7,000 dead, 20,000 wounded, from a force of 70,000, a casualty rate approaching 40%. For context, the Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day, which involved far more troops over a much larger area, had produced roughly 10,000 casualties on the first day, a terrible number, but proportionally much lower than Iwo Jima. Military planners looked at these figures and extrapolated. If a tiny island with 21,000 defenders had cost 30,000 American casualties, what would an invasion of the Japanese home islands cost? Estimates varied, but all were terrifying. Some projections suggested that invading Kyushu alone, just the southernmost of Japan's main islands, might cost 250,000 to 500,000 American casualties. Invading Honshu, the main island where Tokyo was located, could cost even more. Total casualties for Operation Downfall, the plan for invading Japan, were estimated anywhere from 400,000 to over 1 million Americans, with Japanese casualties, civilian and military combined, potentially reaching into the millions. These projections were based directly on the experiences at Iwo Jima and the even bloodier Battle of Okinawa that followed in April through June of 1945. The lesson was clear: Japanese forces, defending what they considered their homeland, would fight with absolute determination. They would accept catastrophic losses. They would make the Americans pay dearly for every yard of ground. And the closer American forces got to Tokyo, the more fanatical the resistance would become. This understanding influenced President Harry Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The decision remains controversial to this day, with historians, ethicists, and citizens debating whether dropping the bombs was necessary or justifiable. But from Truman's perspective, informed by advisors who had seen the casualty projections based on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the atomic bombs offered a way to end the war without an invasion that would kill hundreds of thousands of Americans and millions of Japanese. In this indirect way, Iwo Jima helped shape the conclusion of World War II. The terrible cost of taking that small island demonstrated that conventional invasion of Japan would be catastrophic for both sides. Whether that justifies the use of atomic weapons is a separate question, one that generations have debated and will continue debating. But the connection is clear. Iwo Jima showed military planners what defending the home islands would look like, and that vision was so horrifying that it made alternative solutions, even atomic warfare, seem preferable. Part 11. Memory and Legacy. In the years after the battle, Iwo Jima became a symbol. Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the flag raising became one of the most recognizable images in American history. In 1954, a massive bronze sculpture based on the photograph was unveiled in Arlington, Virginia. The Marine Corps War Memorial, designed by Felix de Weldon, stands 78 feet tall. It depicts the 6 Marines raising the flag, frozen forever in bronze, a permanent reminder of that moment on February 23, 1945. The memorial's base bears an inscription: "In honor and in memory of the men of the United States Marine Corps who have given their lives to their country since 10th November 1775. It commemorates not just Iwo Jima, but all Marine sacrifices across American history. Yet the image remains forever associated with that one battle, that one island, that one moment when a flag rose above volcanic rock and Marines cheered even as they wept for those who had died to make that moment possible. The memorial has become one of Washington's most visited sites, a place where veterans come to remember, where families bring children to teach them about sacrifice, where tourists from around the world stop to contemplate the cost of freedom. The 6 bronze figures, each 13 feet tall, frozen forever in the act of raising that flag, serve as a silent reminder of what happened on Iwo Jima. And beneath that image, inscribed on the memorial, are the words of Admiral Nimitz: "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." The 3 men sent on the war bond tour, Ira Hayes, René Gagnon, and John Bradley, each struggled with their fame in different ways. Hayes, as mentioned, never recovered from the trauma of the battle and the burden of being treated as a hero. He descended into alcoholism and died in 1955 at age 32, found frozen in a ditch on the Gila River Indian Reservation. His story became the subject of songs, books, and films, including a Hollywood movie starring Tony Curtis. René Gagnon lived until 1979, working various jobs, often trading on his status as a flag raiser. He appeared at ceremonies, gave interviews, but never quite escaped the shadow of that photograph. John Bradley, who it would be revealed 7 decades later, was not actually in the famous photograph, but had participated in the first flag raising earlier that day, lived until 1994. He rarely spoke about his experiences. When his children asked about the battle, he changed the subject. The memories were too painful. Whether he knew he hadn't been in the second flag raising is a matter of speculation. He may have recognized the error, but chosen not to correct it, unwilling to add to the confusion, or perhaps believing it didn't matter who raised which flag. Or he may have genuinely believed, as the Marine Corps officially stated, that he was in Rosenthal's photograph. What we know for certain is that he carried something heavy from Iwo Jima, heavy enough that he couldn't or wouldn't talk about it with his family. What mattered to him, it seems, was that Suribachi had been taken, and men had died to make it happen. Harold Schultz, the man who actually was in the photograph, kept his participation secret for his entire life and died in 1995. His family didn't even know until the Marine Corps confirmed his identity in 2016 through careful photographic analysis, comparing images and examining uniform details that finally revealed the truth. For 71 years, the wrong man had been celebrated while the right one remained anonymous, a final irony in a battle filled with them. Iwo Jima itself was returned to Japanese control in 1968, 23 years after the battle. The Japanese government restricts access to the island, which serves as a military base. Each year, a reunion of honor ceremony allows American and Japanese veterans and their families to visit the island, to remember the battle, to honor the dead on both sides. The island has changed little. Mount Suribachi still rises above the beaches. The volcanic sand remains black. The tunnels, many of them, still exist, though most entrances have been sealed. Japanese authorities continue to search for remains of their soldiers. Thousands of bodies remain entombed in collapsed caves and tunnels, never recovered, never given proper burial. For the Marines who fought there and survived, Iwo Jima remained the defining experience of their lives. Veterans spoke of the battle in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all. Many suffered what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt. They had seen things no one should see, done things war demanded, but that haunted them afterward. Lieutenant General Lawrence Snowden, who served on Iwo Jima as a young lieutenant, returned to the island decades later. He described walking the beaches, seeing the black sand, remembering. You could still feel them there, he said. All the men who died, they're still there, in the sand, in the air. You can feel them. The battle influenced American military planning for the remainder of the war. The casualties on Iwo Jima, combined with even worse casualties on Okinawa in the spring of 1945, convinced American planners that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would be catastrophic. Estimates suggested that such an invasion could cost 1 million American casualties and many millions of Japanese deaths. These projections influenced President Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The bombs ended the war without the need for an invasion that would have made Iwo Jima look small by comparison. In the decades since, Iwo Jima has been studied exhaustively. Military historians analyze the tactics, the decisions, the mistakes made by both sides. Archaeologists map the tunnel networks. Researchers identify remains found in the island's caves. And every year, on February 19th, ceremonies commemorate the anniversary of the landing. The lessons of Iwo Jima remain relevant. The importance of intelligence. The Americans never fully understood what Kuribayashi had built until they were fighting through it. The difficulty of dislodging a determined defender from prepared positions. The psychological toll of sustained combat. The necessity of combined arms tactics. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together. The courage required of individual soldiers and Marines when facing overwhelming firepower and certain death. But perhaps the most important lesson is simply human. War is terrible. Victory comes at a cost. And that cost is measured not in statistics or strategic calculations, but in individual lives. 7,000 Americans who died on that island, 21,000 Japanese who died defending it, and the thousands more on both sides whose lives were forever scarred by what they experienced there. Closing. The secret the photograph kept. Remember that photograph we began with? The one that became the most famous image of World War II? 6 men raising a flag on a mountaintop, a moment that seemed to capture the triumph of American arms, the righteousness of the cause, the certainty of victory. Here's what that photograph never showed: the 31 more days of fighting that came after it was taken. The thousands who would die clearing the northern highlands. The Japanese soldiers who would fight from caves for weeks, months, years after the battle supposedly ended. The debate that would rage for generations about whether any of it was necessary. The photograph showed a moment. But moments don't tell the whole story. If you could visit Iwo Jima today, and very few people can, given the restrictions on access, you would find an island much as it was in 1945. The beaches are still black volcanic sand. Mount Suribachi still dominates the southern tip. The airfields remain, though nature has begun reclaiming them. The tunnels are still there, many sealed, others open to the dark and silence. Stand on those beaches, and you could try to imagine the scene on February 19th, 1945. The fleet offshore, the landing craft approaching, the Marines wading through surf, climbing those volcanic terraces, fighting across black sand that swallowed them with every step. You could try to imagine the sound, the roar of naval guns, the scream of shells, the rattle of machine guns, the shouts of men trying to impose order on chaos. But you probably can't imagine it, not really. No one who wasn't there can fully understand. Even those who were there often couldn't explain it afterward. That combination of fear and courage, exhaustion and adrenaline, grief and determination that kept men fighting day after day, it defies easy description. What we can do is remember, not with simple stories of heroes and villains, not with comfortable narratives about necessary sacrifices, but with honest acknowledgement of complexity, of the terrible cost of war, of the way that even victories can carry the weight of too many deaths. Admiral Nimitz said that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. It's a phrase that has been repeated countless times in the decades since, often reduced to empty rhetoric. But spend time studying the battle. reading the after-action reports, the personal accounts, the medal citations, and you realize he was understating the case. What happened on Iwo Jima went beyond valor. It was sustained courage in the face of almost certain death, maintained day after day for more than a month, demonstrated not by a few heroes, but by thousands of ordinary men who found within themselves reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. On both sides, American and Japanese, young men who believed they were doing what duty required of them, who died believing their sacrifice mattered. And perhaps that's the final truth we need to carry forward. That warfare, whatever its justification, is ultimately about human beings killing and dying, about calculations made in war rooms that become reality on beaches, about photographs that capture moments but can't convey the full weight of what those moments cost. So look again at that famous photograph. 6 men raising a flag. 3 of them would be dead within days. The other 3 would spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of surviving when so many others didn't. And behind them, beyond the frame, 36 days of combat that would test the limits of human endurance and leave 7,000 Americans and 21,000 Japanese dead on 8 square miles of volcanic rock. The photograph is iconic, but the story is so much more than the image could ever capture. If you found this exploration of Iwo Jima meaningful, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleepable History. Consider hitting that like button. These stories of the past, these moments when ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges, deserve to be remembered and understood in their full complexity. And there are so many more stories to tell, so much more history to explore together. For now, rest easy. The battles of the past are over. Those who fought on Iwo Jima, those who died there, have been at peace for 8 decades. But their story endures, a reminder of what human beings can endure, can achieve, can sacrifice, and what they pay when called upon to do so. May we remember them well, and may we never forget that the true cost of war is always measured in individual lives, in futures that never came to be, in grief that echoes across generations. Good night. Epilogue. The final reveal. But before we end, there's one more thing you need to know. One final piece of the puzzle that changes how we understand everything we've just explored. Remember that photograph we began with? The one that became the most famous image of World War II? The 6 men raising the flag on Mount Suribachi? That image raised $26 billion in war bonds. $26 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum in 1945 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $400 billion today. That single photograph generated more money for the American war effort than perhaps any other piece of propaganda in history. Here's what that means. The photograph, not the battle itself, but the image of the battle, may have contributed more to defeating Japan than the actual capture of the island ever did. Think about that for a moment. 7,000 Marines died taking Iwo Jima. The official justification was that the island would save 25,000 bomber crewmen, though as we've discussed, historians now question whether that number was accurate. But the photograph? The photograph unquestionably raised $26 billion that helped fund the final push to victory. It inspired Americans at a moment when war weariness was setting in. It became a symbol that transcended the actual battle. And here's the twist that recontextualizes everything. That photograph was of the second flag raising, not the first. Not the moment when Marines actually secured the summit and raised the first flag in triumph, but a replacement flag, ordered up because Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson thought the first flag wasn't big enough, wasn't visible enough, wasn't impressive enough. Joe Rosenthal happened to be climbing the mountain when the second flag went up. He almost missed it. He was stacking rocks to get a better vantage point when the Marines started raising the flag. He didn't use his viewfinder. He just pointed his camera and pressed the shutter. Pure luck, pure timing. And that accidental photograph of a replacement flag became the defining image of American sacrifice in World War II. So was Iwo Jima necessary? Here's an answer that satisfies no one but might be closest to the truth. The battle itself, measured purely by strategic gain versus cost in lives, was probably not worth the price paid. The historians who question it have valid points. The B-29 landings were mostly routine. The fighter escorts were impractical. The island could likely have been bypassed. But the photograph? The photograph was priceless. It rallied a nation. It funded the war effort. It created an enduring symbol of American determination that inspired generations. The image did something that capturing 3 airfields never could. It captured hearts and minds. Which means the greatest strategic value of Iwo Jima might not have been the airfields themselves, but the mountaintop where 6 men raised a flag that happened to be photographed at exactly the right moment, from exactly the right angle, to become immortal. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander who designed that fortress beneath the ground, who made the Americans pay such a terrible price, wrote in one of his last letters that he hoped his defense would make the Americans reconsider the cost of invading Japan. In a way, he succeeded. The casualties on Iwo Jima, combined with Okinawa's even worse bloodshed, convinced American planners that a conventional invasion of Japan would be catastrophic. Those projections influenced the decision to use atomic weapons instead. But Kuribayashi never could have predicted that the island's greatest impact on the war would come not from his brilliant defensive strategy, not from the blood his men spilled or the American lives they took, but from a photograph. A photograph of a moment that wasn't even the real moment. A photograph that 3 of the men in it never knew existed, because they died before they could see themselves become famous. Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan, Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, killed in action before the photograph appeared in newspapers. They raised a replacement flag because their commander wanted better optics. They were photographed by accident. They became immortal without knowing it. And their accidental immortality may have done more to win the war than the month of combat that preceded it. That's the final truth of Iwo Jima. The battle everyone remembers through the photograph wasn't quite what the photograph suggests. The strategic value everyone cites may have been less important than the symbolic value nobody planned for. And the real heroes, the thousands who fought and died in that volcanic hell, have been somewhat obscured by 6 men in a single frozen moment raising a flag that wasn't even the first one. Does this diminish their sacrifice? No. If anything, it makes it more poignant. They fought and died for reasons that seemed clear at the time, but became murky in retrospect. They trusted their commanders, who promised the island was essential. They did their duty in the face of almost certain death. And whether or not the island was worth the cost, whether or not the justifications were sound, whether or not historians generations later would question the necessity, none of that changes the courage it took to wade through that volcanic sand, while machine guns fired and mortars fell and friends died beside them. So look again at that famous photograph, knowing now what you know. 6 men, a replacement flag, an accidental masterpiece of timing and composition. 3 of them dead within days, one of them misidentified for 71 years. All of them representing something larger than themselves, something that transcended the actual moment, something that might have been more valuable than the island itself. The photograph is iconic, but the story, the full story, with all its complications and ironies and uncomfortable questions, is so much more than the image could ever capture. And maybe that's the real lesson. That war is too complex for simple narratives. that heroism and waste can coexist, that the reasons we fight and the reasons fighting matters might not be the same, that sometimes the accidents of history, a photographer at the right place, a flag raised at the right moment, matter as much as the deliberate strategies of generals. Iwo Jima was planned as a strategic necessity. It became a symbol. And perhaps the symbol was always more important than the strategy. Perhaps that's true of many battles, many wars, many moments when we ask ordinary people to do extraordinary things. We fight for strategies. We remember through symbols. And the gap between the two is where the real story lives. If you've found this exploration meaningful, please subscribe to Sleepable History. Consider sharing this with someone who appreciates history told with honesty and complexity. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more moments when the simple version and the true version diverge, when what we remember isn't quite what happened, when the symbol and the reality dance around each other in ways that reveal deeper truths about who we are and what we value. For now, rest easy. The battles of the past are over. But their lessons, complex, uncomfortable, necessary, remain for us to study and understand. Good night.